let me introduce our superb guest today. David Frost began his early life as a British diplomat and civil servant. He served in very high-level positions in several overseas places, including, I think, David, Nicosia, Paris, New York, Copenhagen, and Brussels. In between those stints, he also occupied several senior Foreign Office positions in London. He left Her Majesty's diplomatic service in 2013 to take on a much sounder role of becoming the Chief Executive Officer of the Scottish Whisky Association. Absolutely marvellous. But then, and this is what most people, I think, will know him for, from 2016, he became the special advisor to the then Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, and then the United Kingdom's chief negotiator for exiting the European Union during those crucial Brexit negotiations, which resulted in a revised withdrawal agreement, and we got out. I keep sometimes saying that David is one of the unsung heroes of Brexit, but I think he's increasingly a sung hero as well. And in the full course of time, songs will be dedicated to him and streets will be named after him. After that, he was appointed as the chief negotiator of the Task Force Europe, elevated to the House of Lords as a life peer. He did become a full member of the cabinet in 2021, but resigned, citing Boris Johnson's tax hikes, net zero commitments, COVID-19 regulations, and a range of other things. Moving forward to the last 12 months, in the July 24 election, it was reported that he might be interested to put himself forward for selection as a candidate, but had been blocked from doing so by Conservative campaign headquarters. He is one of the brightest, smartest, most interesting Conservative public intellectuals. And he's often said to me that he thinks he's led his career and his life in the wrong order. We'll have more of that in a moment. David, it's wonderful to have you with us. Welcome. Always great to speak to you. How are you doing, sir?
I'm good. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with where we're at the moment, if you don't mind, David. I mean, unsurprisingly, I think, to virtually all of us involved, the Conservative Party lost the last election decisively, disastrously, some might say, although the scale of the disaster could potentially have been even worse, 9% behind Labour and still forming the official opposition. We've had now, since July the 4th, what is it, almost bang on, touching 6 months of a Labour government. What do you make of their performance so far?
Well, I think we all know it's been pretty dire. I thought it would be bad, but I thought they would take time to get going. As it is, they've just kind of blundered in, really, done a lot of really, really aggressive stuff really quickly. Been very ambitious on things like labour market reform, unwinding all the education reforms, just driving up tax and spend, and they're already paying the price. What normally happens over the life of the Labour government has been compressed into 6 months. And, to be honest, I don't think they know what to do now. I think they have been kind of, I think they thought that them simply coming in and being sort of sound non-populists, stable, in charge was going to solve the country's problems, and so self-evidently it wasn't going to and hasn't, and now they don't know what to do, and they're casting around for solutions and can't find any. So it looks pretty bleak, I think, for the country at the moment.
I mean, their pitch was stability, wasn't it? That, I mean, they said virtually nothing really about any kind of game plan about what they were going to do in office. Stability, calm, the adults back in the room, that kind of thing. The Conservatives have gone completely crazy. I don't know whether they brought about stability, but that was their game plan, apparently. Basically, promise to do nothing, and hope everything comes together. My own view, David, was that I wasn't going to like any of their policies very much. Probably virtually none of them, with the possible exception of reform to the planning system. But I expected them to execute whatever their plan was competently. And I've been somewhat surprised that they haven't executed anything competently. And even more surprised that they didn't appear to have a particular plan. They didn't seem to have a playbook that we're going to do this in the first 100 days. Our priority is X, Y, or Z. We'll leave A, B, and C till later. What's your view of
No.
that? I mean, have they had any plan, whether we would like it or not?
I mean, I assumed they would have a plan. I thought that's what Sue Gray was doing because it's been obvious for, at least a year that they were going to win the election by some degree. And, they just don't seem to have done any of that sort of planning. And they seem to have been taken by surprise by like obvious sort of schoolboy errors, like Keir Starmer's clothing and football tickets and so on, which to everybody that was obvious that wasn't going to withstand a moment's scrutiny, and yet they went ahead and couldn't understand why they were criticized. And I just I am a bit baffled by how bad they've been. I've been going around saying for the last 6 months, remember, they won't always be this bad. They'll get rid of some of their worst people and they'll get it back on track. But I must admit, there's no sign of that at the moment. And things just seem to be getting worse. And I honestly, I dread to think what'll happen. Either they're going to carry on going down this road, and if so, they'll have to put taxes up further and regulate further, because that's what they do, or there's going to have to be a screech of brakes, and they'll have to junk kind of everything they've stood for and everything they say they wanted to do, and obviously that's not very likely. So I fear for the next year or two, I must say, for the country.
Yeah, what do you make, David, about their well, I was going to say their previous assertions in this direction, but I think they're still reiterating them, that there will be a laser focus on growth, that we must get economic growth. I mean, they were almost channeling their internal Liz Truss here, that the only thing that matters is sort of GDP going up as fast as it can, and that might not be a silver bullet to every problem, but it would at least be a bronze bullet. It would at least solve an awful lot of issues. And they seem to be, I mean, what I find odd about that, they seem to be, enunciating and willing the end of GDP growth. That's what they apparently want to happen, but none of the means. Why not actually just say instead, go sort of full Greta Thunberg? We're actually just going to save the planet and make the world a more equal place, rather than pegging your priorities to GDP growth or GDP growth per capita, which it seems evident to me they haven't got the first clue about how to bring about. Or maybe they genuinely believe higher public spending brings that about.
Well, I think there is an element of them believing that high public spending, high taxation is helpful. The more intellectual among them, the Henricks and Bells and people like that, they do look at Europe and say, well, they've all got higher taxes than us, and Europe seems to be a better, nicer place to live. Obviously, that's kind of fantasy view of Europe as it is nowadays, but I do think they bought into, some of this. We need high taxes. We need high quality public services through high taxes. We need industrial strategy. The future is through net zero investment and all this sort of stuff. I think that a lot of them do actually believe that, and I don't believe it. I think it's just a route to making things worse. So that's the kind of good version, that they do have a philosophy. It's just one that doesn't work and I don't agree with it. The bad version, which I'm sure is widely spread, and possibly even our chancellor, Catra's our chancellor, is they don't know. They talk about growth, but they have no idea where it comes from. They spend so much time dismissing free market economics and Thatcherism and so on that they literally don't understand where growth comes from. And you've got this sort of ridiculous casting around, the trip to China, the reset with the EU, all the desperate search for regulators to come up with some idea to boost the economy. And I think a lot of them just genuinely don't know. They have no philosophy that is going to guide them in the next year or two.
So does that mean we basically have a kind of technocratic government? That they've inherited whatever they've inherited, and we can argue on the margins about the assertion of the £22 billion black hole. which I always found utterly fanciful, because even if there is a 22 billion black hole, this is a bit like worrying that your house is burning down because you left a £10 note behind the sofa. I mean, it's a complete rounding error.
Yeah.
So do you think they just sort of basically are not ideologically that different to the Rishi Sunak administration? We'll try to be practical. We'll visit China. We'll ask the regulators, if they've got any smart ideas. We'll throw out a few retail offers, and we'll hope that we catch a following wind. Are they ideological, or are they just technocrats?
I think they are quite ideological. I mean, there's obviously a spectrum. There are some technocrats. There are even some Blairites left. And look at that MP the other day. I can't remember who it was who was denouncing the Labour MP denouncing Labour's education reform bill as going back on Blair's achievements. But I think the spectrum's quite wide. I think it goes quite far left. And, most of the things that are coming out from the government are quite ideological and quite left focused, I would say. There isn't much sign of the the Blair sort of emphasis on kind of openness and markets and this sort of thing. It's very much on regulation and spending as the way forward. And that's why things like Keir Starmer's speech yesterday on AI jar so much, and why people don't take them seriously, because they just seem like they're just not kind of congruent with the wider message the government is giving, so people don't believe them. And I think their problem is now the image of the government is set, the image of Keir Starmer is set in the popular mind, and they're going to find it very difficult to shake all of this now.
That's really interesting. So what do you think might become of them? I mean, as we're speaking today, we've seen their anti-corruption minister have to, in the new words, take a step back, which I think is the modern vernacular for resign in disgrace. Rachel Reeves is considered to be under pressure. I mean, but prime ministers are obviously loath to junk their own chancellor, especially if the chancellor is wedded at the hip about following the agreed strategy of the government. It's not obvious to me that Rachel Reeves has gone off grid compared to the desired strategy of the prime minister. Do you think they just try and muddle through, or do we end up with a sort of Callahan moment in which he says, sorry, I've actually worked out that old-fashioned, naive Keynesianism doesn't work, and we're going to have to try a different thing, austerity is going to have to come in? Or do you think they just sort of try and muddle through, pretend things aren't too bad, try and find, a few more pounds down the couch? How do you see this panning out over the next, presumably, 4 years, given their parliamentary majority?
Yeah, I mean, it is really hard to tell. I think, the most likely thing seems to me at the moment is they kind of drive on the current course, and then hit some kind of crisis, not necessarily an acute crisis, but just, debt, tax starts to overwhelm growth, social protest starts to, become more acute, and, they'll just kind of run out of steam. And then the question is, when they reach that point, and I think they probably will reach it in the next year or two, do they just sort of stop doing anything? They don't try and reset, they just kind of sit there. Or do they say, okay, we got it wrong, we better go on a different course? And I don't see how they can do that without changing the PM and the Chancellor and a few others, because they just don't look like the sort of people who are capable of changing their minds about fundamentals and going in a different direction. And anyway, nobody will believe them unless you really have to change the people too. So if I had to predict, and it's always difficult and nobody really knows, is that they'll run into some sort of crisis stroke quicksand in the next year or two, possibly sooner than that. And then they will just sort of give up and sit there. And then it will be in the hands of the opposition to have made a convincing counter case and to have explained what's gone wrong and why it could be better.
Brilliant segue, David. I was about to do one myself. So what should the opposition be saying about this? And by the opposition, I mean, everybody, whether they're in the Conservative Party or not, who are dissatisfied and sceptical about the supposed strategy of the Labour government. What do you want to see Kemi Badenoch, as the leader of the opposition, saying? I mean, should she just take them to task on things like gilt yields are now higher than they were under Liz Truss? Why won't you have a national inquiry on grooming gangs? Isn't it a disgrace that your anti-corruption minister has apparently resigned over allegations of corruption? Do you just go on that sort of prosecutorial line of how terrible this government is, roughly what Starmer's Labour opposition did to the Conservatives? Or do you try and map out some wider, deeper analysis? Or do you just sort of stand there and point at them about how useless they are?
I think got to do both. I mean, obviously, you should be highlighting the mistakes the whole time. But you've got to have a story and a philosophy that sort of sets all those mistakes in a context and puts your mistakes in your solutions in a context. And I mean, I think we saw the weakness even today, actually, with Mel Stride taking on Rachel Reeves, of the purely prosecutorial approach. For one thing, it depends on the skill of the people doing it, and we don't have that many skilled people in the parliamentary party nowadays, sadly. But also, it just makes you, I mean, for one thing, it makes us vulnerable to the, well, look at what you did, riposte. But unless you've got a kind of counter story, it just comes across as sort of slightly pro forma criticism. You've got to have a different approach. You've got to have a different story. You've got to have a set of principles about how you would do things differently. And that's really what I would like to see developing. I think the difficulty the Conservative Party has, and is possibly a bit more acute under Kemi than it would have been under Rob, is disassociation from the past. Rob resigned from the government, so he could say, well, I didn't support everything. Kemi was there to the end. And therefore she kind of owns, to some extent, what the government did. And unfortunately, most of what the government did was not great. And I think one of the difficulties now is that actually Labour are simply continuing the path that we went on to a very large extent. They're sort of doubled down on it, but they haven't really changed it. I mean, we didn't deregulate, we didn't cut taxes, we pushed on net zero. Now they're doing all those sort of things at warp speed. And it makes it difficult for us to kind of criticize the principle unless we say we got it wrong. We're sorry, we regret it. We simply got on the wrong path. And that is going to be really, really difficult for all sorts of obvious reasons for a lot of people. But I think unless we do it, rather like Keith Joseph's, I thought I was conservative, but now I see I never was. Unless you find some way of doing that, we're just constantly vulnerable to the, well, you did the same sort of thing accusation. And it's difficult really to get the story out then.
That's really interesting. Sorry, the one thing I didn't point out at the start also to our guests is you can give a thumbs up or a heart or a champagne cork in the emoji icon below. So if you like what David's saying or like what I'm saying, I'm not sure there's too many ways of doing thumbs down, actually, but the more thumbs up or champagne corks, the better. But do you think the Conservative Party, what would be its mea culpa moment? So I was having lunch with a Conservative thinker today and saying sort of, how did Tony Blair divorce himself from Michael Foot's manifesto, which he initially ran on, albeit as first time he became an MP, and then you had Kinnock and unilateral disarmament and, nationalising the FTSE 100. And yet by 1997, he's in a completely different place. And the answer came, clause 4. That was, the way that Blair indicated a complete split from the past. What should Kemi Badenoch do to indicate that split? Or even Keir Starmer distancing himself from Jeremy Corbyn, right? Corbyn was sort of frozen out of the Labour Party. Starmer wanted him to be Prime Minister at 2 general elections, but he rather quickly was able to sort of hermetically seal Jeremy Corbyn and not let him back into the Labour Party. And okay, he's still an MP, but he's not on the Labour whip. What's the equivalent for the present leadership of the Tory party?
Well, it's a good question. I think, probably there has to be some sort of bust up with the sort of Lib Dem left of the party. I think that's probably how it happens, because we don't have a sort of party organization like Labour does, or a constitution in the same way. We can't formally change. All we can do is like signal by who the parliamentary party is and who is held in esteem in the party. That is the symbol of kind of the direction of policy. And I think, probably it's only going to be clear in potential supporters' mind when some of that Lib Dem fringe, either accommodates themselves visibly to what's happening or move on and leave the party. And, in my mind, there's what we did in 2019 with under Boris to take the whip off those MPs who wouldn't vote for leaving the EU. And, that was pretty brutal at the time. And sadly, we've let quite a few of them back in since then, but it did the job. And, I think the last government was so bad in so many ways that it's going to require something like that. Now, I'm not saying that, we should deliberately have a confrontation gratuitously, but I just think that the process of getting policy in the right place is likely to produce something like that, because in the end, the party's just too wide, and we have to focus down, and that wing of the party has to accommodate it or to it or not, I think.
So there's a few questions here, David, roughly on this theme, which I might put to you together. Jeff Mitchell asks, how many true Conservatives are in the parliamentary party? At conference, an MP suggested to me about 24. Another question was on, given most of the parliamentary party pushed for Liz Truss to be removed, is it worth sticking with the Conservatives at all? What do we make of the present ideological makeup of a diminished parliamentary party? I mean, in the House of Commons, of course, the 121. And I guess you can read something into it about how they voted in the leadership election, but not an enormous amount into it. You mentioned the Lib Dem fringe, or I guess, in 1970s, 1980s terminology, we described them as the wets. What's your rough audit of that 121 in aggregate?
So I think the balance hasn't really changed from the past government. It's just that all the numbers have got a bit smaller as the party's shrunk. And I still think there's, maybe 25%, sort of strong Conservatives in various ways on the right, maybe 25% sort of One Nation on the left. And to be clear, I don't mean all of them are in a sort of Lib Dem group. I think it's a fringe of a fringe, as it were. And then you've got 50% in the middle who kind of, don't have extremely strong convictions either way, and want to hold their seats, want to do the right thing by the country, and are willing to be led. And I think, in the end, it's very difficult for the party to accommodate that range of opinion without some narrowing down. And Rishi Sunak's attempt to accommodate it all produced disaster, because nobody knew what we stood for. So that I think is what's got to come.
I thought it was changing A levels and abolishing smoking. Wasn't that the
that was the
principle? Yeah,
the big picture. Yeah,
but again, I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to nail your feet to the floor here. But you're suggesting that somehow there needs to be a bit of a kind of winnowing out, almost a step backwards, perhaps lose a few MPs in order to be able to make a more unified step forward. You reference the removal of the whip from those that wouldn't countenance the Brexit deal under Boris. Do you think that's the way to go? Perhaps there's 4 or 5 MPs that you actually say, look, no, I'm sorry, if you don't sign this particular pledge, who knows what it would be about? I don't know, leave ECHR for sake of argument. Then you're gone. And maybe, which I think is what happened on the harsh discipline over Brexit, if 4 or 5, 6 or 7 are removed, it sort of pour encourage les autres. Those people in the middle who are sort of, well, I probably lent that way, but crying out loud, if I'm going to be expelled from the party, I'll tack towards the leadership position. Do you think we need to do that quite quickly to actually say we don't mind falling to 105 MPs if 10 or 15 defect or go independent, because that will give us a greater clarity of purpose moving forward, rather than being such a broad church that we're a cathedral without walls?
Yeah, I think it's tough for the party. But the truth is, and maybe so, I'm not really a party person, obviously, as you said in your intro. I came to politics quite late. I don't have the same kind of emotional attachment to the Conservative Party as others. I'm not kind of lived all my life through it, which in many ways is a problem, but in some ways is an advantage because I can look more objectively at it. And the truth is, the Conservative Party's brand in the country amongst anybody under about 60 is shot to bits. People would not admit to being conservatives. Conservatives is a fringe opinion. The party is held in disdain. And the younger you get, the worse any of this gets. And if we're going to save the party, there's got to be a break with the policy making and the attitudes, and perhaps some of the people have driven us to this point. If we don't do it, the party will end up just disappearing. We're already falling in the polls. I mean, that seems to be forgotten, that we've declined even from the terrible election results, and it requires dramatic action. And it requires a shift to becoming a more conservative party. That's, I think, the way we try and pull people back in from reform. But that's never going to happen unless it's completely credible that the future direction is different from the past, and that we tie ourselves to the mast of doing things differently in a more conservative policy direction in future, and that has to come with consequences for people. Otherwise, it's not credible.
So, going back to our earlier thoughts, I didn't expect the Labour government to be this bad this fast. And I guess if you had told me on the morning of July the 5th that by the start of 2025, the Conservatives will only be 3 or 4% behind Labour in the opinion polls, I probably would have ripped your arm off for it, having lost the general election by the best part of 10%. But reform have clearly emerged enormously. I expected them just sort of start to fall away. Loads of people voted for reform because they're right of centre, but were sick to death of the Conservatives. And once they get a little bit of dose of socialism, they'll have not necessarily buyer's remorse because they didn't vote for the Labour Party, but the default is they'll switch back to the Conservatives. Well, this hasn't happened at all. Nigel Farage's ragtag and bobtail gang of 5 MPs are putting up one hell of a fight on social media, on national television, in building a narrative compared to our 121. I think the latest opinion poll, again, snapshot, but seems to be roughly in line with most others, was Labour 26%, Reform 25%, Conservatives 22%. What do you put this really quite remarkable rise in the Reform vote down to? Up 10% since the general election. And as you rightly say, from our lowest base, our worst election result since, my great-great-great-grandfather was denied the franchise, we've gone, if anything, slightly backwards from 24 to 23 or 22 in the context of a Labour government falling to pieces.
Yeah, well, it's important to be honest with ourselves. We've now had 3 polls that put us behind reform. Maybe it's not quite a trend, but it's certainly suggestive at the moment. Let's see how that continues. But I think one can't avoid. I think part of the problem is people's memories of the Conservative government are still extremely fresh. So frustration and anger with Labour doesn't necessarily take them straight back to us. Maybe that will fade. Maybe we can do things to make it fade, so I'm saying. But at the moment, that's a real problem. We have to face also the facts that if you look at the polling charts, if you look at the Spectator one, for example, of the last 6 months, what you saw is Labour vote declining, going roughly equally to us and Reform. Then after the leadership election was concluded, that stopped happening, and much more of the Reform vote continued to go up, and ours started to tick down again. Now, interpret that how you will. It may not be about who the leader is. It may be that people were waiting to see what the result was and then acted accordingly. But there does seem to have been an inflection point at that moment. And to me, that shows that we're not properly in the game at the moment, and we need to do things to get back into the game. There's a persistent tendency to underestimate Nigel Farage. And, he's obviously an extremely skilled politician. He did predict that the polls would do this, I think, after the election. And I wasn't sure I believed him either, but it's turned out like that. And, we are in the Conservative Party, we're in a street fight with Reform now. And it's a fight for the right to be the leading opposition party, and we've got to get serious about that fight. And at the moment, they're winning it.
What's the point? Why don't we just join the Reform Party? I mean, they're saying let's leave ECHR, let's abandon carbon net zero. I mean, you might say that they've done a lot of the diagnosis without much of the medical prognosis about how to solve it. But I think at the last election, I rather preferred the Reform Party's manifesto to the Conservatives one. And at least in terms of, if you like, the key cleavage points, carbon net zero and immigration policy, the state spends too much, the quangocracy is too big. What's the point at which we just say, well, the Conservative Party, well, that was quite lovely for 250 years or whatever it is, but, it's no longer fit for purpose.
I mean, I think people are beginning to say that now, and I wrote a piece about this, that I think the main thing that's still dissuading people, as far as I can tell, amongst certain parts of the Conservative Party, is, as you say, that Reform still looks a sort of slightly ragtag and bobtail outfit. There still are visible internal arguments even amongst the five and a few others and a few outsiders, and there's still the sense that a couple of things turn against them and they might just descend into arguing, and then the whole thing disintegrates.
Well, then they'll be even more like the Conservative Party. Yeah.
Well, then we'll feel at home.
Yeah.
But the bigger their membership gets, the longer this lasts, the more every time they withstand an external shock, like Musk's comment on Farage doesn't seem to affect them, then the less likely that becomes. So that's the problem for those who believe in the Conservative Party. And I still think the Conservative Party is the best, most plausible way of delivering the right policies. But in the end, I'm interested in the right policies and getting the country in the right direction, not the future of the Conservative Party. And actually, I think that is a quite widespread opinion in the country now on the right. And if the Conservative Party gives the impression it's more concerned about its own future than about the country's future, then that will be extremely damaging for it.
Yeah, this is interesting. We got a swathe of questions, David, on sort of how should Kemi approach this? What should the relationship with Reform be? Is it possible to steal their clothes? So let me just machine gun a few of these at you. Ian Bocking says, good evening, Lord Frost. There seems to be no motivation for members to actually support the party, the Conservative Party, he means. Reform seem to be making all the running with nothing really coming from our leadership. What are Kemi, etc., doing? That's one of the questions. Again, I'll machine gun a few at you. Stephen Pontin says, do you think there should be more cooperation between Reform and the Conservative Party? If so, what form should it take? And I think I saw another one saying, was it an error for Kemi to wade in criticising Reform's membership numbers? When should Kemi set out her broad brush principles and sense of direction for the Conservative Party, asks Sheldon Wilkie. How should we approach reform? For all we've said, ragtag and bobtail, the reason I'm still in the Conservative Party are for reasons that you've just enunciated. It's still about nip and tuck between Reform and Conservatives, but we've got 5,000 councillors, they've got 50. We've got 121 MPs, they've got 5. We've got 200 members of the House of Lords, they've got 0. That, you know, I still think that for all of its problems, the Conservative Party is still most obviously the vehicle if it can, you know, get the engine pumped up right and get some petrol in its tank. But how should we approach Reform UK? Do we sue for peace? Do we embrace them? Do we invite Nigel Farage to join the Tory party? Or, you know, is there a kind of Mexican standoff in which, you know, only one of us wins? I mean, you wrote a great article in the Telegraph, with just putting a link in the chat now, about, you know, there isn't enough space for two right of centre parties. So do we merge or collaborate like the Conservatives and the Liberal Unionists? Or do we have 2 years of shadow boxing and then proper boxing, and, you know, the winner comes out alive and then takes on Labour in the final?
Yeah, it's too soon to say, I think. Speaking as a Conservative, I think the right strategy in the short run, anyway, is to become a properly Conservative party and try and convince people of that and try and pull people back from Reform that way. And I think we're being a bit slow off the mark in that, to be honest. You know, people compare this moment and Kemi to the Thatcher opposition period and the stepping stones time and all this sort of stuff. Well, A, they didn't have Reform around then, and B, there wasn't any doubt about what Margaret Thatcher thought about the world in 1975. She might not have set out, you know, exactly how they're going to control inflation or what the first phase of trade union regulation was going to be, but on the big questions, tax, spend, position in the Cold War, all this sort of stuff, you knew absolutely what she wanted to do. And she went around giving a lot of speeches, making all this absolutely clear. And I think if Kemi's going to get in the game, get the party back in the game, she's got to do some of that. There's somewhere in the middle between like doing nothing and, you know, setting out the detail of policy, which, you know, obviously we shouldn't be setting out every detail, but we need a policy on net zero, for example. At the moment, we don't really have a policy properly. We need a proper policy with numbers on immigration. We need a proper policy on the ECHR. You know, we need to be absolutely clear it's our intention to get tax and spend down and to deregulate and get growth up again. You know, we should have a policy on NHS reform. We don't need to say exactly what it is, but we could definitely say the current model is failing. You know, we're going to look at European style ways of doing it and expect some results from that process over the next few years, but that's what we're going to do. You know, you've got to get something on the table at that sort of level, I think, to convince people that we are active thinking and, you know, that we can occupy the space the Reform is occupying. Because at the moment they're saying a lot of those things, and it's quite appealing to people. So, you know, that's the first thing. Can we get back some of our people from Reform? If not, I mean, you know, if we obviously we're going to lose if the right is still divided when the election comes. Therefore, the question has to be solved. And if it isn't solved through merger or gradual, the balloon of one or the other party just sort of shrinking, then there will have to be a pact of some kind. But the problem is that if you reform, why would you go into a pact with a Conservative Party whose policy offer is different? It makes no sense. And if the Conservative Party's policy offer is the same, then why do you need the two parties? You know, why won't organic merger just happen? So that's where I struggle with the pact as being the solution. I can't quite see the situation that it's a solution to at the moment.
No, that's interesting. And I should apologise to David Peddy, whose question's been the most upvoted since we started. And this goes a bit to, how the Conservative Party should position itself, David. He asks, is Kemi right to take up to 2 years before announcing any new policy initiatives? He says, I feel there is a vacuum which we are failing to fill and hold this appalling administration to account. Kemi is getting better at PMQs, but still needs to be tougher. And I wonder if I might just sort of interweave that with your thoughts that you just shared, David. I'm not really sure that we need to come up with detailed policy, but I think we do need to come up with unambiguous positions, right? So you might take the view, for sake of argument, that the burden of tax needs to fall without spelling out that you're going to cut corporation tax by 2.5% in your first budget or put up income tax thresholds. You might take the view that immigration needs to come down without specifying a particular number, but you could signal that, I think, by saying we are definitely going to leave ECHR. You might take some sort of view on decarbonisation over the long run, but you could signal that you thought the present trajectory was wrong by saying that we are absolutely not committed to carbon net zero by 2050, and we will repeal all legislation in that area. So I'm just wondering whether Kemi has a tendency to either be at 30,000 feet or ground level. And I think there's something in between where you can indicate a direction of travel, some signposts like abandon carbon net zero, leave the ECHR, without necessarily wedding yourself into exactly how border force would actually behave under a new Conservative administration.
Yes, that's exactly
so
right.
Do you think that that's what's sort of missing? That, a few clear signals. We didn't know, going back to Thatcher, exactly how she was going to reform trade union law, but we knew unambiguously that she was highly sceptical about trade union power. Is that what needs to come from the Conservative Party? And
I think absolutely that's exactly where we need to be. And I mean, two things really. One, I've kind of given up going round talking to Conservative associations for the time being. I did
that
a
probably
lot of
explains
it.
why I'm getting so many invites. You're no longer on
Sorry
the
about
rubber
that.
chicken circuit. Yeah.
Feel free to pass them on. I because I don't know what to say. I just don't know what our policy is in a lot of areas, and I don't know what I'm kind of encouraging people to support. I know what I think, but that's not necessarily where the party is. And I think there does come a point when you get up in Parliament, when you're talking to activists, when you're arguing with the government. You kind of need to know roughly where you're going and what the party's approach to things is. So we absolutely got to set that out. I would also say that it's crucial that when we do it, suppose on net zero, for example, suppose our policy is the principle set out by Kemi is less than destroy the whole of the climate change committee and net zero 2050 for whatever reason. Whatever it is, it's got to be clear that comes from conviction and belief, not from this is what I think I can get the party to put up with. I'd really like to do more, but unfortunately we can't say it at the moment. I think that will just weaken the brand again, recreate all the concerns that people have about what is this party really about? What is it really trying to do? So I just want to see some leadership, I suppose, really. What do you, Kemi, think about the world? Where are you trying to take us? Tell us. And, say, I know you don't all necessarily want to hear this, but this is what I think. Follow me. We just need some of that, I think.
So Martin Bristow asks, is Kemi too concerned with party unity to do the things Lord Frost suggests need to be done? The clock is ticking. Have we got ourselves into this position where we're trying to hold together some sort of legacy centre-right coalition that might have worked in the 1980s, but now is actually divided on questions of immigration, Brexit, even tax and spend, the quangocracy? Is it, do we think the Bank of England is doing a fine job or not? I gather the Shadow Chancellor thinks it is. I don't. I think the Bank of England's a complete disgrace. So it might have been a coalition that would hang together on the massive kind of key dividing issues of the 1980s or the 1990s. But that coalition is now split on the major issues that we face today: immigration, climate change, nationhood, and the rest of it. So, I mean, do you think the leader should just take a stand and be done with it? Or how sympathetic are you to her trying to hold together a broad coalition, which is what our party system and indeed our electoral system demands? Under first past the post, you need to build a coalition before the election and put it to the voters. Under PR, you stand on, if you like, a position of principle and then stitch together a coalition after the election behind the backs of the voters.
I mean, yeah, obviously to win the election, you've got to build um, a coalition. I think we should be aiming to build the coalition with the people who've gone to reform on reform-like policies. I think that's a much more propitious way of building, a genuinely meaningful electoral coalition than trying to hold together the, as you say, the sort of legacy Conservative Party and opening a space on the right the whole time. That's the big problem. I think her strategy would work if reform didn't exist, but we're not in that world, and politics is different. So I do have sympathy. The Conservative Party is always quite close to having some sort of collective nervous breakdown about things, and she's probably kind of aware of that, and that's why she's treading carefully. But in the end, if you're the leader, you've got to lead. You've got to say what you think and what you're trying to do, and invite people to come with you. And I think people would respond to that if we could get it.
And I want to go down a slight rabbit hole here, given we've got more than 160 people on this call, most of whom will be members of the Conservative Party and activists in the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party machine itself, put aside what we stand for, what the leader says in a speech, what lines of attack she uses at PMQs, what she might say in an interview with Marie Claire magazine. The structure of the Conservative Party seems to me completely broken. I mean, the local associations effectively can't select candidates. God only knows why. I mean, I appreciate there are no safe seats left, but God only knows why you weren't on the shortlist for whatever was left at the last election, and many like you. So the machine at the centre seems built around crushing any form of local independence, potentially stripping associations in heavily conservative areas of selecting their own candidate, most egregiously, the chairman of the party himself, putting himself on a short list of one at the last minute for the safest Conservative seat in the country, pretty much, and then only holding it by 20 votes. There is no really meaningful feed through into developing policy. I mean, there is the Conservative Policy Forum, but the Conservative Party conference is a rally. I mean, it doesn't make policy in the way that Labour conference or Liberal Party conference does. CCHQ, I've not heard a good thing about it from anyone who's had to deal with it at grassroots level. And I hear even worse things about it from people who have had the misfortune to work there, that it's a complete shambles. We seem to be operating, if you were to look at us against Reform, for example, they are a fleet of foot, exciting startup. And we're a sort of legacy quango with endless processes and form filling that can't actually get anything done and stitches things up in the interests of a small cabal of those at the top. Do you think if we nobody on the doorstep at the last election said to me, well, I won't vote Conservative because I disapprove of your parliamentary selection procedure, or I don't like the way that CCHQ designed leaflets, or, why don't you have a better logo or more witticisms on Twitter? But I wonder whether actually the engine in the car is so broken that you've actually got to strip that away, somehow democratize the party without being a complete free-for-all, empower members, get people involved in a Conservative movement, probably shut down CCHQ, which would basically be a compliance office. If you think you've got great comms and campaign skills, fine, but those can be franchised out. Doesn't need to be run from the centre. We seem to be practicing at CCHQ level all of the things that true conservatives say that the state should never do, centralised planning. Were we to just overhaul all of that, even though it's not a game changer in terms of headlines, might that make us match fit to rebuild the party and actually win a general election? It would just change the dynamics and have great second and third order effects.
Yeah, it absolutely has to be done. And of course, it is the only thing we actually have power to do at the moment. So we might as well do it. I think, it's very obvious to me last year, going around campaigning, talking to associations, that, the party was sort of, disintegrating. People were giving up. People were going to reform. The attitude to HQ, to CCHQ was, I mean, hatred doesn't put it too strongly in some cases. The degree of frustration and anger that there was with the centre was just extremely, extremely high in some places. And this dysfunction all needs pulling down and rebuilding, and that is really difficult. And as I say, I'm not a party person. I don't claim to have a kind of easy solution to that. I do think it would have, I mean, I have nothing against Nigel Huddleston as the MP chair, political chair, if you like, but I do think it would have been probably a good start would have been to have a big figure with lots of name recognition, and somebody who the party had a bit of affection for and thought was on their side in bringing through this change. And
but there is no change. I mean, I'm not aware of any change there
no,
yet.
I don't. I'm not aware of anything that's happening at the moment. And again, one has to work out what you want to do, and it is a totally dysfunctional organization. If it was a business, you'd probably kind of wind it up and start again somewhere else with the same purposes, but you can't do that. You've got to stick with what you've got. But Rob Jenrick's campaign was very, very centered on party reform. That was a big element of it. And of course, he said Jacob would be chair and so on. It hasn't been quite so big in Kemi's kind of set of propositions. And it does need to be, absolutely, because the party is the members.
There's no, quite. And that's the bit which, I mean, you're so right to say this is the bit we can sort ourselves. I mean, I guess the national media might put it down to complete sort of navel gazing. I don't know if we, reduce the membership subscription or have a campaign to try and overtake reform again for members, or, change the selection process. But some of it, I mean, anecdote alert here, and a bit like you, David, I mean, I'm not really a party man. I'm a member of the Conservative Party, but I haven't been embedded in it. Only joined when I left the IEA a year ago. But I mean, some of the anecdotes you hear about the processes are barking mad. I mean, I spoke to somebody who, at first blush, looked like she could be a very good PPC. And went through sort of emotional intelligence tests. One question of which was, have you ever considered murdering your parents? To which she answered no. She still professes she doesn't know whether the correct question was yes or no, but nevertheless, she answered honestly. And I think on her file somewhere, which she finally got via the Information Commission, it just said at the top, not an ideal candidate for Surrey. I'm trying to work out what on earth the party was piecing together. Maybe if you're willing to murder your parents, you are an ideal candidate for Surrey. I don't know. I have no idea what the sort of mechanism putting all of this together is. Obviously, you need a sort of central command that makes sure that you haven't got sort of, Holocaust deniers or, people with a serious criminal record or something as candidates. And you need to comply with the law. So, forms need to be filed with the Electoral Commission every quarter or whatever it is. And you need to check her donation is legitimate, and people on the membership database, have their data safely secured. But it should be that and no more, right? And then, I mean, it's basically a brass plaque somewhere. It doesn't even need to really be in Westminster. The leader of the opposition needs a press office and a Westminster arm, but just do that. And if somebody believes they've got a comparative advantage in, I don't know, designing leaflets or, getting messages out on Facebook, well, take your business to the private sector and see how many conservative associations employ you.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it has got too centralized and controlling, and, we need to sort of loosen the dead hand of central control, undoubtedly, on the associations. As you say, there needs to be some kind of backstop processes, but, definitely there needs to be more freedom. I'm not convinced that the whatever it was, the A list, candidate list, and the processes. I mean, we've all heard the weird anecdotes like you describe. I'm not convinced that's produced a better set of candidates than it would have just to leave it to the associations, and at least you'd have candidates to whom associations were loyal and invested in if you'd done it that way. So I do think that that's got to be a big part of the solution. But I do think, maybe I'm unusual, but then, probably everybody on this call is kind of unusual in a way, in that we're party members probably and interested in politics and care about the issues. And, I think one's got to play to that a bit. People like us come into politics because, we want to get things done. We think we know how the country ought to be run. We probably have an idea of how it would be different to now and the sort of changes that are necessary and what's going wrong. And, we need to get people motivated again behind a set of ideas. This is what we stand for. This is what we're going to do. This is why the country's wrong. This is how we can put it right. And, get that sort of argument and persuasion out to the country again. And if the Conservative Party doesn't do that, well, perhaps Reform will do it, but nobody else is going to do it. We've got to have a set of ideas, a belief about the country, a set of beliefs about what's going wrong and what we would do, and get people out there talking about them. And, that is not what most people want to do with their evenings and weekends, but it is, I think, what brings people into politics.
David, I provide a niche product. What more can I say?
That's what politics is about. It's about ideas. It's about persuading people. It isn't about just keeping the show on the road. That's government and bureaucracy. Politics about ideas and explaining to people and winning arguments. And that we're not good at yet.
A bit of energy as well. Let me just finish on a couple of questions here. Might sound like a couple of curveballs, but Russell Walters asks, what do you say to the observation that Rupert Lowe, the Reform MP for Great Yarmouth, for those of you who don't know, and I should add the former chairman of Southampton Football Club, so all around a good egg. What do you say to the observation that Rupert Lowe alone has been a more effective opposition than all 121 Conservative MPs put together? At this rate, by the time Kemi has laid out her platform, Conservatives will have had possibly years of listening to him and other Reform voices saying the right thing several times a week when our MPs are predominantly silent. Stephen Byrne says, what evidence is that Kemi Badenoch is a real Conservative as opposed to a wet? I mean, we've gone through a bit of the challenges she faces in kind of keeping the party together. But do you think it is only about sort of developing your arguments and putting them forward, or maybe these are peas of the same pot? Or do you need an energy and enthusiasm such that you actually want to get out of your bed and off the sofa to actually put it forward? Going back to what you were saying about you're a bit less inclined to accept invitations from Conservative associations for their local dinner or such like. Is the problem that there isn't really much to say, whereas Rupert Lowe is off the leash? He knows what he thinks. If he's got an interesting angle on it, it's up on Twitter, he's on GB News, he's writing in the Telegraph, 250,000 people are retweeting it. I looked at the Conservative Party's official Twitter channel. I mean, it's pathetic. They have more followers than me, but about the same footprint on Twitter as I've got as an individual human being. So although we need to get our arguments right, is some of it about just letting people off the leash and having a bit of enthusiasm about it, which it seems to me the 5 Reform MPs have got. and our 121 Conservatives rather less so.
Yeah, definitely. Energy really matters. Enthusiasm really matters. Rupert Lowe is doing a great job. And, he's using parliamentary mechanisms already to great effect to get info out and then sort of multiply it into the public domain really, really well. Reform have an advantage that they're not they don't have a sort of policy legacy. They don't have this problem of uncertainty about what they stand for. I mean, I compare it to somebody like Claire Coutinho, for example, who's the energy net zero spokesman. I think doing a good job generally. She is actually pushing at Ed Miliband about this. And I don't know what her own personal views are, but she seems a little bit skeptical to me. But, she's kind of restrained by the fact that the party's policy is unclear. And there are probably quite a few people who don't agree with her. So it's difficult to be quite so energetic unless you can bring this clarity, which brings us back to the point we started. You need to know what your policy is and what your policy space is and what you're trying to achieve. And when I was doing the Brexit talks in 19 and 20, it was most of that period was absolutely horrible. I mean, I know it was for the whole country for a lot of it because of COVID, but it was sort of super horrible for those trying to do this as well. But you still get out of bed and still was enthusiastic about it because I thought, well, this is really important. We're doing something that's really important for the country here. We've got to get it done. And so you knuckle down and do it. And if you don't have that sort of core belief, you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then, it's difficult to generate the energy. I think the two things go together, really.
Just going to finish on a personal question to you, David. Sorry again, not trying to corner you or anything, but you're presently on the red benches in the House of Lords. Wouldn't it be better to have you on the green benches in the House of Commons? Is that something you might be looking to do if the appropriate circumstances arose?
If the circumstances arose, I don't know what the Conservative Party think. I don't even know whether I'm on the candidates list anymore, to be honest.
They don't call, they don't write.
Yeah. No, exactly. I don't know. I've had almost no contact with the leadership of any kind since November. But yes, I mean, power, influence, real politics is in the Commons. It's imperfect, but the Lords is not like that. So although it is incredibly frustrating moment, and I think probably we all feel a bit discouraged by the general sort of grimness of the government and the situation and the difficulty of laying a punch and our own divisions. It is really quite dispiriting at times. Nevertheless, we've got to keep going and build our enthusiasm and try and do our best. And I haven't given up doing that yet, so we'll see.
Well, David, don't give up. Before I thank you, just a few adverts for our gathered throng. Thank you so much. I think we've had more than 200 people over the course of the last hour have been on this Zoom call. Sorry I couldn't get to all your questions. I'm doing the best I can to think and process and try and batch them together. But just to let you know, we've got 2 more PopConversations upcoming. On Thursday, the 23rd of January, that's say next Thursday, I'll be in conversation with the former deputy co-leader of Reform UK, Ben Habib. And then shortly after that, the following Tuesday, the 28th of January at 7 p.m., I'll be in conversation with Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas in the UK, to talk to him about what we might expect from a Trump presidency shortly after Trump has been inaugurated. In the chat box, there are links to both of those, but you can also click through on our newsletter or on our website. If you're not on our PopCon opinion panel, please think about joining. Conservative Home have an opinion panel of about 1,000 or so Conservative Party members. Every once in a while, they ask questions, gather it all together, publicise them, and try to get that information fed in to the leadership of the party. I think we've got about 800 on our panel. I'd really love to top 1,000. So if you're on it, please get a friend to join it, as long as they're a member of the party, ideally, and spread that far and wide. We'd like to build that as a real way of testing grassroots feeling, not just to impact on PopCon's thinking, but the Conservative Party itself. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. Sorry I couldn't get through all 102 questions. I did my very best to get at least 12 or so together. And please hit the emoji, thumbs up and the hearts to thank David Frost. David, it's been great to hear from you again. More power to your elbow, sir. It's vital in our diminished state that we keep thinking, keep acting, and are brave about putting forward a proper Conservative approach to things and are honest with ourselves about what's gone wrong. And I can't think of anyone who's done that better in Parliament than you over the past few weeks and months. So, David, thank you so much. Been an absolute pleasure to have you for a little over an hour. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. You'll be invited back to many, many PopCon events, but it's been a real delight. Thank you so much.
Been great. Thanks very much for having me. Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Good night, all. Keep the faith. Keep fighting for freedom. Over and out.